capability. All right, so it's being recorded. So again, welcome to the session. Everybody should be able to see my screen, tips for calming down angry customers. It's interesting that this was like the #1 issue, other than the one that said anything you want is good with me. I just like sitting in on them. This was the one that had the most votes that we seem to be having ongoing, and I don't think that that's unusual. I think that that's very, very typical for our business. Many of you in November and December particularly, you've got folks that are dealing with stress of the holidays, stress of spending a lot of extra money, maybe bonuses that didn't come through and stuff. So I think there's a lot more emotional stress. I think there's some statistics about how much more crime there is and domestic violence during the last two months of the year, just because people are pretty wound up. So we're going to talk particularly about some techniques for calming them down and for calming you down, because I think, as we mentioned before, there's very little that you can do to change their natural reaction to being angry or natural upset level. But what we can change is ourselves and how we let that get to us or not. Those of you that are in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and probably all of you by now have seen that videotape of the Fort Worth police officer that was addressing a mom who had called because a neighbor had apparently grabbed her son by the neck because he was littering. And what happened there was she was very verbally abusive, and the officer was not able to calm not only her down, but himself down. And so we saw that incident kind of spiraled out of control. And I don't want to cast any kind of judgment in that situation, because we've all been in those situations where somebody actually pushes a button and we just roll with it, and it's very, very hard to grab that situation back into a controllable situation once it's spiraled out emotionally. So let's talk about that. Please feel free to use the chat box. Again, I want to be sure that we use examples that are pretty familiar with us. And speaking of that, think about the resident who comes home at 5 minutes to 6, right before you're closing. The work order to repair the sticky front door has not been fixed, so they pick up the phone and call you real fast right before you're about to walk out the door. You quickly look it up, and you have a completed service stub in the system. So now what do you do? Because they're pretty much on fire. After a resident event, a resident posts photos on their Facebook account and slams the party. You see it, what do? You pick up a ringing phone, and it's an applicant. She said she left a message for someone 2 days ago and hasn't gotten a call back. A text from a resident comes in asking why his late charges are for this month, what his late charges are for this month. The office gives him an amount which happens to be wrong. The resident texts back very upset and says he's going to go to Facebook and make sure that everybody sees that, or we'll go to apartment ratings or Renter's Voice or any one of the many, many ways that our residents can express and say how they feel about us. This kind of stuff happens all the time. The challenge is too many times it ends up here. Excuse me. I have a tickle in my throat today. If it doesn't give you an option to enter your name, then please do it in the chat box. That's what the chat box is used for. So you have to remember that oftentimes, and this situation with this Fort Worth police officer is going to end up right here in the witness box with a prosecuting and defending attorney and a judge. This is a student setting, so you can see that the judge doesn't look very formal there. but it's going to end up here. And so before you jump in to respond at all, you must think that any conflict, any kind of response, any kind of attitude, any kind of tone of voice, what you say can add up in a courtroom. So stay focused in two areas here. What does the resident need, and how am I going to protect my owner? It is very, very easy when you have had a challenging day to get sucked up into that emotion. I have been there. I know that. And I know that it's easy for us. We're all sitting at a desk right now, sitting in front of a computer, and we can look at things almost like in a third party person. We're like, oh, well, that's happening to somebody else. But I want you to be sure to think as we go through some of these suggestions, the fact that if they catch you at the wrong moment, and I can be verbally very short, so I want to be sure that we keep the two things here. We need to solve the problem, and sometimes you have to dig through a lot of emotion to get to where you can step in and solve, and we need to protect our owner. And that means we need to not make the situation worse. Not make the situation worse. Whatever has happened, whatever the trigger is, we'll talk about that. Whatever the trigger is, we can't go back historically and change that. What we can do from day one is protect the owner. So conflict comes from a lot of different things. I'm not gonna, you can all see these on the screen. Hopefully you were able to download the slides beforehand. I did not get them done in time to send out with the invitation, but they were sent to all managers and to regionals and admins afterwards. So conflict comes from assumptions, right? And that's probably one of the ones that's worst. We assume something, and either they don't deliver, or you assume a duty. For instance, here's a good-looking maintenance tech, and you assume that this maintenance tech knows how to rewire an electrical outlet. And so when the work order comes in and he does it and he says it's done, and the resident says, well, it still doesn't work, and you have a sit down with the maintenance tech, they admit that they didn't know how to do it. You assumed without asking them that they knew how to do it. You know, 5 years in the industry is just that. It's 5 years in the industry. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're good at something. I think I would be very, very careful about assuming that your leasing person that you hired knows how to handle a phone call. We had a meeting yesterday, Mike and I had a meeting yesterday with Gwen Pierce, who's the vice president over at Alden Torch, and talked about properties and needs and stuff. And you know, that's a lot of the differential there is assumptions. What should I be doing? Should I assume that person knows what they're doing? Assumptions. Without assumptions is a decision based not on fact. So we move forward and we forget to ask. Prejudice. Prejudice is my background, my last company, what I'm used to doing. Those have shaped us. Every single one of us on this call have been shaped by where you have been and what you have done, what your duties and responsibilities have been. Not listening, yeah. I know we all deal with those people. I had a boss for a number of years who I could just tell when he wasn't listening, because he was, you know, either doing something else, wasn't making eye contact, but not really listening. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Perceptions, these are based largely on your upbringing. Perceptions are based largely on your upbringing, the way you perceive work, the way you perceive pay, the way you perceive taking care of a home, the way you perceive parental care. Those are all come up from your perceptions. Stereotypes, of course, are also come from your perceptions and your upbringing. Stereotypes also come from your prejudice. but they also come from media. Media absolutely wants to shape our stereotypical decisions about things and people and process and products. Your social groups. Think about your Facebook friends. Why do you think social media and reputation and brand avenues have become so popular? Stereotypes. My maintenance supervisor in the past has always been the one responsible for maintaining the inventory and ordering parts, standard parts. That's a stereotype. It's also an assumption. And if your maintenance technician, your maintenance supervisor doesn't do a good job at that, you're going to be disappointed and conflict will arise. Now, obviously, we're talking with staff, but think about that in terms of residents. That's another thing. They walk in the office and their experience, their perspective is going to come from their prejudice, which comes from their last living experience at a property. Their assumptions are going to be shaped by where they were last. Their assumptions may be shaped by the previous manager or the previous maintenance technician. And maybe you are in the midst of restaffing or reorganizing the property, all of which is excellent, but you are going to be battling the conflict of assumptions, perceptions, stereotypes. Lack of empathy is probably one of the #1 fuels that ignite conflict. If I can't get into your shoes and sense how upset you are, whether I agree with you or not is irrelevant. But people are used to not being empathized with. Nobody sympathizes them. We'll deal with it. It is what it is. And so they come in with that chip on the shoulder. Lack of empathy. And lack of empathy is selfishness. It's unable to identify or unwilling to put yourself in the shoes of someone. Now, yesterday it was so funny. Gwen was explaining a phone call she'd gotten, whenever in her last many years with in the business, from a resident who was complaining that her car had been towed, but she had not purchased the sticker, and she had also been evicted for not paying her rent. So she was just wound up, and when empathized, yeah, that would be really bad if my car was towed and I walked out to, get in my car and it wasn't there. But she did her research and she went back and said, here's what I found out. But the point is, especially at the initial conversation, she empathized. Yeah, that's a tough road to hoe. Let's see what happened. I'll get back to you. And so she recounted exactly what happened. But she came at it from a position of empathy. And then expectations. Many of you on the call, you have shared with me before, and I have certainly shared with you, I tend to have expectations that probably are too high, and that I need to not figure that everybody's going to operate at the same level that I do. That's not necessarily fair. Now, some expectations are reasonable, but again, remember, expectations are based on your assumptions, your prejudice, your perceptions, stereotypes, where you've been, who you've worked with, where you've lived before, what happened, what your family's been like to you in the past. So expectations. So all of these are very, very valid reasons that we have conflict. So I think you need to be aware of that. And in the spur of the moment, you may not have the presence of mind or the time to sit back and go, oh, well, he's assuming, or he must have lived at some awful place before. And I think that happens a lot with our affordable clients. They are used to being either taken advantage of or not taken seriously or disrespected. And that's not us. That is not Alpha Barnes. It better not be Alpha Barnes. So there are 3 types of conflict. An internal issue is their issue. It is not yours. You cannot solve internal conflict. This might be, you know, I'm not getting enough pay. I didn't get the bonus. My company just gave me a layoff notice. My car just quit. I don't have any money to get it fixed. My 3-year-old is sick. You know, those are all things that are going on. My Aunt Jody, who took care of me all my life, has got fourth stage breast cancer. Those are all things that are going on in our residents' lives, and it is their issue. It is not yours. You have your own internal issues, right? But here's what happens with internal issues. They can manifest themselves in interpersonal conflict. If I'm having some pretty serious issues, and maybe they're made up, maybe they're issues that arise because I'm a pathetic manager of cash, and I have no social filters. So I'm a maniac when it comes to interacting with other people. That's still their issue, but it can manifest itself into an interpersonal relationship. And that can obviously be a conflict that you've got with someone else. We have some residents that we really love. We have some residents that we'd love to give, you know, owner's notice to vacate to. And it's because of how they handle us. It's because of how demanding they are. It's because of their tone of voice. It's because of their attitude or their perspective. And that becomes an interpersonal conflict. Now, you cannot change someone who is psychologically mad about life or disappointed in themselves, and it manifests them in that perception and just being an angry person, a disgruntled person, a person that does not like interacting with other people. You can't change that. What you can do is understand it, and then again, structure your response. That's all you can do, is structure your response. Do not waste your time on trying to turn somebody who is internally conflicted into somebody who's happy and carefree. It just isn't going to happen. And you will feel less successful and less accomplished, and you yourself will internalize that emotion. And don't go there. Be the professional. There are other times of conflict. The structural conflict is something that's probably, I'm going to say, is the easiest to solve because it's probably the most evident, but they still might not like the answer. It's something about a policy. It's something about, and obviously when somebody these days have a policy that upsets them, they try and work around the policy. Structural means something wrong with the property, something wrong with their apartment, something wrong with parking, or something that is organizational or institutional or environmental. And again, sometimes they're easier to fix. They oftentimes are easier to identify, but underneath a structural conflict can be an internal conflict. I think internal conflicts, when people are conflicted internally, it drives the other two. And again, you cannot fix the internal conflict. What you can do is listen for where you can plug in, because believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, there will always be a place where you can plug in and solve. Always. I know that's a big statement, but 100% of the time, there is a place for you to plug in and address the situation. So lots of times these three things, they're kind of below the surface. They don't show up. They're not evident. You don't know that a person is in turmoil when you don't interact with them, but oftentimes there's a trigger that ignites it. And again, it could be something that you can control. It could be something that's going on in their life. They have a parent that died, and the siblings are arguing over the house and its contents. I mean, those are things that I'm obviously making this up as I go along, but those are things that you can't control, but they are going to be the triggers that will allow that internal, that interpersonal, or that structural conflict to show up. Somebody thinks that something isn't fair. Oh my gosh, that happens all the time. I mean, we're not talking about employee conflict, but that happens all the time. If somebody thinks that somebody's not being treated fairly, or Mary got this and Jody's in your office saying, why don't I get it? That's something that certainly applies as well. But we're focused here today on resident conflict. But you and I know that, especially when it comes to modifications, accommodations, exceptions to the policy, if somebody got it and I didn't, I'm going to be in your face. So just understand it for what it is. And I think one of the first things you do is empathize with that. Hey, I grew up in a family where I had brothers and sisters, and one of my brothers or sisters got something that I didn't get. I was upset. And I figured out a way to either get it or work around it. So I hear where you're coming from. Competition, of course. Some people are more competitive than others. Anybody who feels threatened or out of control. And for our profile, lots of times that's absolutely the case. They work in perhaps unrewarding or potentially unrewarding jobs. They potentially are living month to month with on a very thin margin. And if something minor happens, or what we might consider minor happens, it tilts the whole balance in their household. And that triggers conflict. And so they're going to see if they can try and make it up in some other way. And oftentimes they're going to look to the landlord to do exactly that. That shouldn't be a surprise for you. And it really comes down to, what are we gonna do? It's your way or my way, and I don't have much control over anything else, so I want control over this situation. So I'm going to fight real hard from my perspective. Think about yourself, guys. Think about yourself, whether it was in a previous employment situation, whether it's in a personal or family situation. If you want your way, you're going to fight for it. Unless somebody or something reasonable can help you find middle ground somewhere. And when somebody is really fired up and emotionally wound up, you don't have a chance to find that middle ground. So how we address that conflict from the very, very beginning is what's going to be very important. So on this slide, and it's kind of funny because it's when you teach a subject, it's easy to say that this always happens, and of course we all know it. Oftentimes it doesn't. But these are 10 words that can fuel people's anger, and obviously no is one of the worst ones. Customers, residents, prospects come to us to solve a problem. And it can be a whole variety of things. They want an exception to the policy. They want an extra day on their rent. They want you to evict their neighbor who's very noisy. So as soon as you say no, or any kind of like no response, they're going to be upset. So it's almost like sending them elsewhere, or just pushing back. So saying no or can't, well, we'll look at all of these. Can't is the next one. Saying no or can't means is not good. So on the first one on no, find some way to say yes. Yes, that sounds like it's a problem. Yes, that I would be upset too. At least find some way to say yes. You can always find a way to say yes. Can't is actually worse than no, because can't implies that you could do something, but you're not going to. I could, but I can't, but I'm not going to. So it's always better when we're conversing with an angry resident to say, here's what we can do. And I would use we. I'm a huge fan of we, unless it's very personal. If it's something that you're closing the door and we're really kind of digging in, then make it personal. I can do this. Here's what I can do. I can pick up the phone this afternoon and see if I can locate my supervisor, or call my supervisor on their cell and see what I can find out. I can look into it. Or I can research, the work order, and I can research where Bobby's been the rest of the day, this instead of can't. Obviously, impossible is awful. Impossible is the same as no, but with an exclamation point. So when something's impossible, what do you think when when somebody said that's impossible? Well, just say, here's what we can do. Go back to here's what we can do. When you ask a resident who's angry why, that tends to be fuel on the fire. Why do you want that? Instead, just say, tell me about why, tell me about your service animal. So tell me about your assistance animal. Or even if you use the word why, but just say, tell me why. I don't like why. I like, help me understand. I love those 3 words. Not with an attitude, but help me understand what I can do for you on this. And let them try and explain it. What is a bad word? Because it often means like I'm not paying attention. It makes people repeat themselves, and that means that you're not paying attention. So in one case, it can even mean that you're doubting them. So better to say, excuse me, or pardon me, or could you repeat that? In other words, I got it, but I want to be sure I got it right. Policy, of course. Anytime we use the word policy, when we're talking with a person who's conflicted, they get upset. Better to say a guideline, or protocol, or typically. That isn't the way that we handle these situations, rather than policy. Our policy says, or as you can see in your lease paragraph 47, which of course they never looked at, to them, that's going to be, and my little note here says, that's seen as a dodge. Lots of times you have to use policy, but if you throw it around, people say that you're dodging dealing with it, you're just quoting policy. And maybe you are, but it's how you present the policy. Our standardized approach, our typical approach, customarily, normally, in the past, as a rule, those are all kind of comments that you can use that help without saying policy. Listen, if you have to calm somebody down because they're shouting at the top of their lungs and you can't get a word in edgewise, do not shout, at them. Listen, you're not listening to me. They may not be listening to you, but don't call it to their attention. The little committee in the back of their head is telling them you're not listening. You're being too loud. Calm down. Just wait. I would not interrupt them. I would not try and get your 2 cents in. Remember, we're going to go back to the my way, your way sign. At this point, when they're venting or bringing you an issue, listen. Do not say, listen to me. You're not listening. Yeah, right. How does that work with a 4-year-old? That's kind of where we are when we're upset. Wait, wait just a minute. No one wants to wait. Nobody wants to be told you're going to have to wait on this. If they have to wait for something, put that in a positive spin. Here's what's going to happen next. You're not telling them they're going to have to wait. Here's how I plan to take care of this. You're not saying the word wait. Wrong, of course. Wrong. I'm sorry I wasn't clear. I'm sorry that you misunderstood me. Let me clarify that. Is better than saying wrong. You thought this. I meant this. I am so sorry. They're not wrong. You either didn't communicate fairly, correctly, didn't put it in writing, whatever. People don't like to be wrong. I hate being wrong. And I hate worse somebody telling me that I'm wrong. It's different if I come to that conclusion myself. Oh gosh, I didn't pay any attention. Yikes, I got that wrong. And then of course this one, oh my God, this is probably the worst. It's always, always, always too late to ever say should have. Had they known, they should have, they could have. There's guilt and there's blame with should have. Yeah, you should have called me earlier. Better to say, I wish I had known about this earlier. Go back to putting it on you, not them. When you say you should have, you're telling them that they did something wrong. Just say, I wish we had known earlier. If we had known, you let them decide that they should have called. Don't tell them. See the difference here? So 4 steps that the multifamily executive advises, and I love it. I love it when things are easy. I think that it's always important to come at it from the perspective. That doesn't mean that you're going to claim liability, but just this little caricature in this little picture, assuming it's your fault, apologizing. I am so sorry. If that would have happened to me, I get where you're coming from. Do you know what that does to somebody who is just charged up and on fire? I am so sorry. Oh my goodness. Even if you just express amazement, oh my goodness. Let's see what we can do. Assume it's your fault, but don't say it's your fault. Just say, I am so sorry. Here's where we come to the empathy, guys. If it happened to me, I would be upset too. Let's talk about it. I would also allow them to let go. Now, we'll talk here in just a minute if they're very angry, because I don't want you to put yourself in a dangerous situation. But let them go. I would also and kind of at the same time go to this next slide, which is why obviously you're not going to be drawing this picture, but mentally what you're doing here is you're letting them vent, because remember, you're looking for that one place in every argument where you can step in and begin to solve. So you may think that the resident's objective is to get a pet without a pet deposit by claiming that it's a assistance animal. Okay, so maybe that's objective. So let's talk about that objective. Is that a pet or not? So listen for that person's objective. They may be telling you all kinds of stuff, but your job as the professional, you've got the power, you've got the authority. So take the time to kind of figure out what are they really after here. Now, you have to do that with still listening. So I'm a huge fan of when we're here allowing the resident to vent and you're trying to figure out what the objective is. Let me take some notes. Look at this guy's got notes. Let me jot a few things down. Do you mind if I jot a few things down? Oops, sorry. So that we can figure out what to do next. Let me jot this down. And then asking the questions while they're venting. When did it happen first? Who did you talk to? What happened first? What day was that? That tells me if I've got the complaint that you're listening and you're trying to dig in. That's important. That's incredibly important. And then you've got to obviously think about, is there something you can do about it? And that happens while you're writing down the notes, because your questions while you're letting them vent will help get through the emotion to what I can do. And I would not be afraid to say, what would you like us to do? how would you like what would you like to have happen next? Because what you've got to do is connect. You're like a liaison. You've got to connect with what they want and what you can do. And then and in between what they want and you can do is the checklist of things that are going to happen to get to that point, if they can get to that point. I mean, there's someplace in the middle. Notice that I think that now that I look at it, this little picture with the goal in the middle is really a good one, because that's where it's going to be, somewhere in the middle. Now, you saying things like, this is typically what we do. Let's see if we can meet somewhere in the middle. That tells the resident, without pointing a finger at them, that you're going to work with them, but they may not get exactly what they want. Your job is to do this, and maybe you can't do that because they're so wound up, because and your time to think about what you can do about it. So you just have to say, you know what, I've got some notes here. Let me reach out to my supervisor. Let me do the research that I need, whatever it is that you need to do, and call you back. Where are you going to be by the end of the day? What number can I use? And then, of course, you're going to have to do it. But that allows you the space, because not all of us can think about solutions. And lots of times the solutions that we come up with while we're in the middle of the emotion is not the right solution. But it buys you a little time. It buys you a little space. And it also is very concerned. If you've taken the time to listen and write notes, they're going to be a lot more likely to let you call them back, especially if you narrow it down almost like to an appointment. One way or the other, I'm going to call you back at 2. I think I can track down my regional. They're out of town or whatever. They're out on a property walk or something. But I'm going to see if I can find them. One way or the other, I'll reach back to you at 2 o'clock. Obviously, we've already talked about this. Pointing fingers is not going to happen. It's very, very hard to deal with. Oops, I'm sorry. I want to show situations here. These are 3 situations. The pool is closed, the parking lot renovations, and we've got a water main burst. When you've got bad news to deliver to residents. So this is a part of conflict too. This is where you've got a situation that you can't change. And maybe it means you're going to have to shut water off to a building, or you're going to have people park somewhere else while the seal coat sets and the striping dries, or maybe you've got an issue with the pool or whatever. Any time that you've got a situation where you're going to perhaps make people raise conflict, here are some tips for that. Don't procrastinate. If you know that it's happening, get the word out. If you tell me before you discover it, even if they're at work today and we've got to shut off water, get the message out. If you tell me ahead of time, it's a reason. If you tell me afterwards, it's an excuse. That's just the way that I deal with it as an individual. Claim ownership. Whether it was a city main that's broken, here's the message, folks. I don't care whether it's a city main that's broken. If it's a city main, you have a response that does not negate the responsibility that you have as a landlord. It's affected our entire community. Representing the owner, I want you to know. Now, you're not necessarily going to say that, but just take ownership of the issue. Be concise. People don't want the sad, long, violin-laced story about what's going on. What's happening? When is it going to get fixed? That's what everybody wants to know, right? Is when is it going to get fixed? When am I going to be back to where I was before? So absolutely important to avoid conflict in situations where you feel like you're going to get conflict. The big thing here is to remain calm. That resident or that prospect is not somebody who is upset because you put onions on their taco when you asked for no onions, or when they didn't they left a smudgy fingerprint on your car when you got it back from the shop. That's not a typical business person. It's also not your supervisor being disappointed because the numbers you didn't calculate the numbers correctly on a report. That's an upset that is way different than a resident or a prospect. So remain calm and keep that perspective. If somebody's messing with my home or my home situation, I'm going to be a little bit more upset about that. Now, speaking about upset as we close out here, if they are really enraged, and this guy looks really enraged, you cannot change their rage, but here are a couple tips for managing that acute anger. First of all, and the first one's probably the most important, is managing your own anger. If they're just plain old angry, you don't feel like they're going to get violent or anything, but they are just wound up. It's like that video of the Fort Worth police officer. That woman was wound up, and I don't know that I wouldn't be either. A mama bear protecting her cub is probably the worst encounter you want to have, and she was on fire, and he did not manage his own anger at being yelled at. So we've got to understand that we can't change their anger. We can manage not getting sucked into that vortex. And I got to tell you, folks, that is a magnetic vortex. That resident wants you in their chili. So don't go there. Don't go there. Calm composure. We always, there's the saying that the clothes make the person, and look the role before you have the role, and all those kind of things about impression. Maintain that calm exterior image. Your hands are not, you're not nervous, your eyes aren't darting, you haven't taken on the power position. A calm outward composure will help you and will help the resident. It'll probably piss off the resident because you're not buying into their anger, but just remain calm on the outside for your own image. Breathing is very important. Here's what happens. Steady breathing. It also helps you focus on how you're handling it while you're listening to what the issue is. Pay attention to your body language. I can tell you that when your breathing goes up, when you get angry, you tend to breathe faster. It's like any time a situation where you're having to gasp for air or breathe faster, do you know that your voice actually goes up an octave? And so you might have a normally very reasonable voice, but wait, your voice goes up. So watch your breathing. You may not even be aware of it, but you start to sound like a shrew. So watch your own breathing. Listen to understand. We've talked about listening again, and it's a powerful way of slowing down someone's anger. Help me understand. Let me take some notes. Then what happened next? Listening to understand means I'm trying to fact find. I'm trying to figure out why this upset has occurred to you. So help me help you. Almost like the Jerry Maguire thing. Avoid interrupting. We talked about that before. If you are disagreeing, if you don't agree with what they're saying, do so while you acknowledge the fact that they have a right to their position. They have a right to their perspective. I see where you're coming from. I respectfully want to take a different perspective, and don't disagree. Don't say disagree. I disagree with you. Well, I have a little different perspective. Do you mind if and maybe they say, no, I don't want to hear your dang perspective. Okay, well, I'm coming at it from a little different perspective. I think somewhere in the middle we can meet. Disagree is really not good. I disagree with you. Ooh. if you are being verbally abused, just, be very strong and assertive after you're listening to them. Just ask that, I ask them to please, stop the verbal abuse. I'm here to help you, go back and go back to the note taking where you got your last little factoid. So you were telling me Thursday when you got home from work, and try and steer the conversation away from the abuse. If it gets too bad, you might have to slowly stand up and say, I can't apologize enough for this upsetting you as much as it has. Maybe it would be better if we talked later. Now, it's very hard to extract yourself from somebody who's verbally abusing you. But the last thing you want to do is put fuel on the fire there. This is an office. This is a place of business. My job here is to help you. So if you'll please stop the verbal abuse, I think we can come to, we can have this conversation. Remember that they realize, I just have got to believe, in my experience, they know they are out of control. They know there's a little voice in their head that's saying, you are out of control. Quit with the swearing. There's a little person in there. Sometimes that voice is very, very tiny and can't be heard by the person. Other times they'll listen to it. And you don't want to embarrass them. They know they're out of control. So again, if it's any kind of situation where you feel like you're going to get jumped or bumped or physically, there's going to be some violence here, don't hesitate to be rude and just say, that's another recommendation, is to not let them be between you and the door. If you feel like it's going to be, or if you can get them into your office and they're just yelling at the top of their lungs and verbally abusing you, and you have some concern, just say, ask a coworker. Don't ask permission. Just say, Mary, would you come in here too, please? Kind of like, I want you to hear this. Not like, I need help. Oh, you need to have somebody come in and listen because you're afraid of me. Ooh. Say, Mary, would you come in here too, please? I need to have you hear this, if you can. So bottom line here, it is natural. Every single one of us today will have a conflict in ourselves, not with a resident, but in ourselves. It has a source, a place that it comes from, and there will be a trigger. Some of us won't have any triggers today. The source will go on, but we won't have a trigger. The bottom line here for you is to understand that you can control your reaction and the outcome. You have power and authority, and that's why they've come to you with the conflict. There are some amazing numbers. I don't have them in front of me here, but there are some amazing numbers on how conflict, when it's resolved, actually creates more loyalty in a resident. That a resident who has you take care of something, even if it's not exactly what they wanted, is actually more loyal to you than in the past. Rather than someone who never has a conflict, never sees you, pays their rent, stays with you for 9 months and moves out. They don't get your brand. They're not a fan. So I know that that's hard to imagine when you're in the middle of somebody who's yelling their guts out at you. All right, that is the end of our session today. It is 9:50. Wow, I'm sorry, I went a little long. I see that somebody wrote in the chat box, where do I see that video? That video of the Fort Worth police officer, I'm sure, is posted on YouTube somewhere, or just Google up Fort Worth police officer. I'm sure it'll pop up. Everybody's talking about it. It's getting played way too often. Just doesn't make it any better. I do have somebody who wrote in on really angry residents. Is it okay to ask them to leave the office if they are calling you names and screaming so loud that everyone can hear them, even with your office door closed, and they're causing a disturbance with prospects? That's a tough one. I think my first reaction would be to try and calm them down. I am, this is a place of business. Please help me help you by focusing on resolving this. What would you like us to do? And come at it from that perspective rather than asking them to leave, because they are going to storm out. It might get even worse. I would be happy to have other managers weigh in on that if you would like to. That is a tough one, because usually that is exactly what happens. They're very upset. They're calling you names. They're being verbally abusive, and frankly, everybody is waiting on you to take control of that situation. So I would ask them to not, please don't call me names. I'm here to try and solve the issue, and just remember that everybody's watching you. So how you try and calm this resident down will build up your credibility or not. But again, we don't want to have you in situations where you are going to be potentially in trouble. Any comments on that? I would try and calm them down and just remind them that we're in an office and to please not, make this personal. I'm here as a manager to help our residents. I don't want you to be upset like this. Let me take some notes. Help me help you. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for being on our first session. I said I was going to show you the email. Since I've gone long, I probably will not do that because I have already gone long, and I hate to do that. Your managers, your regionals got it, as well as your admins. Just some feedback on the survey results, and I do appreciate all 70 of you that responded. I'm going to close it off, and we'll move forward. So thanks again. We have another early session in February. I'm sorry for the first of the month date, so the close to the first of the week, but I hope that works out okay. Thank you so